a U.S.-sponsored plot against Nicaragua. That's how the country's veteran president sees UN accusations of human rights abuses. What started back in April as peaceful protests against pension reforms has descended into a brutal crackdown on dissent in a nation once hailed by the left for overcoming dictatorship and a U.S.-backed counterinsurgency. In an exclusive interview with France 24, Daniel Ortega blames the crisis on Washington. In the wake of revelations that Venezuela's military approached the Trump administration for help in toppling that country's leftist leader, we'll be asking about Washington's current doctrine in a Latin America where political instability is on the rise. A chance as well to take stock of the so-called Bolivarian alliance, the bond between like-minded left-wing leaders in the region, and ask what further change now awaits. Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Daniel Ortega as he speaks to France 24. Joining us from London, Bianca Jagger, founder of the Bianca Jagger Foundation for Human Rights. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
From Washington, D.C., Michael McCarthy, research fellow at the American University. Welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Correspondent Cindy Regidor is in San Jose, Costa Rica. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Daniel Ortega calls the United States, quote, a genocidal power. Nicaragua's president accusing the CIA and others of training rebels. And he doesn't rule out a U.S. attempt at military intervention in his interview with Mark Perlman. Yet, Nicaragua's president also contemplates the possibility of a sit-down with Donald Trump later on this month on the sidelines of UN Week in New York.
I think that the principle of exchange, of dialogue, between a power like the US and Nicaragua, and more generally all of Latin America, is necessary and unavoidable.
Have you tried contacting Trump?
No, I've said I'm ready to discuss with him.
The UN General Assembly could be an opportunity.
That could be an opportunity. Yes, I'd like to go.
Cindy Regidor, you were in the room when that interview took place. Your thoughts on that exchange?
Well, it was very interesting how the president sticks to the insists and how this is a soft coup performed by the United States. Nonetheless, I don't think that he's got any solid proof on that, but this is what the government and what it keeps repeating on the interviews that he's been giving for the past weeks. I think I got the sense that they are very into spreading the word out and convincing people in Europe and in the States that this is what happened, that this is a coup and that the government is now doing okay, that things are back to normal. Although the day that the actually was took place, Nicaragua had a national strike that was called by the private sector.
And a strike widely followed. Cindy Regidor, in the interview, we heard him say that the United Nations is doing Washington's bidding, that the Catholic Church, which was called in as a mediator, was only picking up the talking points of the opposition. And at one point, he mentioned Germany and Spain as possible interlocutors for this government.
Well, I think that the president believes, or at least this is what he says, he feels that this is all a conspiracy where you have the United States, the United Nations, the OAS, and some countries in Europe doing the same thing, which is trying to destabilize his government. This is what he's been saying, like I said before, since he's been giving these interviews. And this is also his excuse for not calling the dialogue back again. This is his excuse. He thinks that the conditions are not the best because everyone is conspiring against him and against his government.
How did he seem during the interview?
I beg your pardon?
How did he seem during that interview?
I think he was pretty comfortable, despite him not being very used to interviews, because before this crisis started, he had never given any interviews to local journalists, no press conferences. I think that he's getting a little bit used to doing these interviews. He's not, I wouldn't say that he's he's great at giving speeches or anything. He's a little bit, I would say, slow when it comes to coming with answers that when he's not maybe expecting some questions. But he did pretty good. I think that he's very comfortable with his discourse, although sometimes he can be a little bit hesitant when it comes to questions that he's not expecting.
Let me ask Michael McCarthy, go back to that original clip that we heard. What are the chances of Daniel Ortega? The interview is like 25 minutes long. He bashes the United States through most of it, and at the end he expresses the fact that he's open to meeting Donald Trump on the sidelines of UN Week later this month in New York. What are the chances of that happening?
Well, my first observation is that in some ways it sounds a little bit like our president here in the United States. You know, Mr. Trump likes to bash other leaders and then, you know, opens the door to potentially sitting down with them. So perhaps that's what Ortega had in mind there. Now, I don't think there are very good chances that there would be a sort of one-on-one sit-down. But I think in the broader scope of things, what we have to keep in mind here is that not very long ago, the government of Nicaragua had basically come to an agreement, or at least an understanding with the United States about sort of getting along on a number of fronts. Then these protests began. They caught many of us by surprise, including the Nicaraguan government, obviously. And as a result of that, I think there's been an intelligent effort by the United States and other governments in the region to promote an electoral solution by pulling the date forward and having a vote that would provide a kind of escape valve for the current crisis.
And he was very emphatic during the interview. It's going to be no election before 2021.
Right. He currently isn't feeling much pressure on the streets, so he's not going to make any concession along those lines. And he has, for the moment, it seems, been able to ride out the storm. But that doesn't mean that it's over, right? So, you know, these crises tend to go through phases, and it's an extremely volatile situation still. So, you know, he succeeded, so to speak, in holding on for the current moment, and he stonewalled the opposition with the dialogue and so on and so forth. And, you know, what the international community is going to continue to call for here, I think, is credible dialogue that works toward an electoral solution that includes all the key players in the process.
Bianca Jagger, what's more significant in that interview, Ortega bashing the United States or Ortega bashing the Catholic Church?
I think that Daniel Ortega's interviews, not just the one he gave to France 24, but overall all his interviews are full of false claims, false accusations, contradictions, and is not different, except now he's found a new reason to accuse the U.S. because there's been recent reports about the meeting between the army from Venezuela who came to request help from the United States for an intervention. The United States has no intention of intervening in Nicaragua. You are speaking to somebody who for years fought against the Contra War, fought against any intervention in Nicaragua. We know very well that this is not a coup that is being provoked by the United States or by anybody else. This is really an internal peaceful resistance against a dictator that has been in power for too long, that has managed to dismantle the legal institution, and that doesn't want to really have a dialogue. And in fact, at the beginning, when the church, the Catholic Church and the Council of Bishops called for the dialogue, I supported it, even though I was very, very skeptical about the possibility that there could be a dialogue with Daniel Ortega. And what did he do? Just simply use the dialogue to kill the opposition, to kill the students, to kill children, to kill journalists, to kill the poor farmers, and to put in jail innocent students, innocent farmers, innocent journalists, anyone that will speak out against him. Daniel Ortega is only looking for reasons not to allow the Nicaraguan people to have free election, not to allow the Nicaraguan people to aspire to have justice and democracy in Nicaragua. This is completely false that the U.S. is trying to intervene in Nicaragua. We don't have oil. And I doubted very much that Donald Trump is interested in meeting with Daniel Ortega. If he wants to have a dialogue, why doesn't he have a dialogue with us? Why doesn't he have a dialogue with the people in Nicaragua that have been asking to sit down at the table with him? And his accusations, his outrageous accusation of the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church is biased, that the Catholic Church is mounting a coup. I don't know if you are aware that he has been using the paramilitary and the death squads to go against and break into churches, to attack the bishops, to attack religious leaders in Nicaragua. No one is saved. I would love to go to Nicaragua. I like Daniel Ortega to assure me that I will not be killed, that I will not be attacked, just like Mr. Maradiaga or any political leader in Nicaragua when they go to the country. I would like to know, what does he intend to do? There are 40 students, innocent students, young kids who are in jail accused of being terrorists. We have the leader of the poor farmers that is in jail, that has been tortured, and that is not been allowed to have a doctor. We have cases of women and men who have been raped in Nicaragua. This is a ruthless, brutal, murderous dictator. Let's not be confused. Let's not be distracted by his accusation that there is that the United States want to invade Nicaragua. That is the past. That was Reagan. This is Donald Trump. He's not interesting. What you had is some members of Congress that have been able to impose the Magnitsky Global Act on some of his member of his government.
Yeah, to sanction them. Bianca Jagger there mentioning something important. After last month's drone attack against Venezuela's president during a military ceremony, the New York Times over the weekend reporting that rogue elements from Venezuela's military met with U.S. officials, several meetings starting last fall, continuing into this year. The main request of the military plotters, they say, was encrypted radios, but the United States never granted the request. And after multiple meetings, the Venezuelans became frustrated. Mr. Maduro's government has since jailed dozens of the conspirators, though many remain at large. Not just Nicaragua, but also Bolivia, quick to denounce Washington for taking that meeting. Same, of course, with Venezuela, whose foreign minister has taken to Twitter in the last 24 hours saying it's absolutely unacceptable and unjustifiable that officials from the government of Donald Trump participate in meetings to encourage and promote the violent actions of the extremist elements with the aim to plot against Venezuela's democracy and national peace. Michael McCarthy, should those U.S. officials have taken that meeting?
If I was in their position, I would probably not have taken the meeting. I don't think it's advisable to sit down with people who are making such a direct request, although I understand why U.S. officials would want to try and get more insights into the thinking of some of the dissident members of the Venezuelan military. And I think that's really what the big story is here, that the U.S. is trying to gain a stronger comprehension of the thinking of people inside some of the security institutions inside Venezuela, where the U.S. has not really been able to establish a solid line of either communication or information about what's going on there. So I think that this was a bit of a mistake by the Trump administration, but as you pointed out from the article, that the request was denied. And it's also quite evident that this is a very complicated situation. So, for example, the story notes that a number of the officials that U.S. government administration sat down with, U.S. administration officials sat down with, happened to be sanctioned, in fact, by the United States government. So that tells you that really we're sort of pulling on every lever we have or that might be available to try and come to a better understanding of this crisis, especially inside of Chavismo, the political movement that Nicolas Maduro draws his legitimacy from, the extent that exists any longer. Now, I think in the broader scope of things, the United States is probably going to continue its pressure campaign. And the question is, what is the next step there? I think that it's a question of when, not if, regarding more sanctions. But it's not necessarily the case that there's going to be the use of the most heavy-duty sanctions tools in the toolbox. And that's because right now, the United States has not really placed Latin America at the center of its global agenda. President Trump has not yet traveled to Latin America. There's an announcement that he will visit Buenos Aires and Colombia at the end of the year for the G20 Leaders Summit. But until the U.S. administration makes clear what the stakes are for U.S.-Latin American relations, it's going to be hard to imagine a scenario in which there's real attempts to deal with these very big problems in countries like Nicaragua and Venezuela, and Cuba as well, obviously.
And Cuba as well, countries that have a close bond. You're saying, in other words, there is no Trump doctrine?
Toward Latin America, no. I think globally, the best we can say about Trump is that he's transactional, and that if there's something like a framework for foreign policy, it might be called forceful persuasion. So there's a lot of big talk, and there's a lot of use of the stick, and we're beginning to see some signs of what the carrot may be in a couple of cases, beginning with North Korea. Trump also suddenly proposed that he could sit down with the Iranians, right? So he is somewhat of an enigma on that front, and I think personally, I think that's how he likes it. But something like a doctrine, no, I don't think we can say that that exists yet.
All right, we'll pick up on that with the rest of our panel when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Hello and welcome to Managua, the capital of Nicaragua, for an exclusive interview with the country's president, Daniel Ortega. The country is going through one of its worst crises, a crisis that has claimed a number of lives. We'll talk about the human rights situations, the relationship with the Trump administration, and the threat of international sanctions. Please join us for this exclusive interview here on France 24.
Exclusive on France 24 and France24.com. People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyze how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit on France 24 and France24.com. You might watch France 24 in English, but don't forget, France 24 is also broadcast in French, Arabic, and Spanish.
Muy buenas tardes, bienvenidos a las noticias de France 24.
Available on cable and satellite systems and online media in France and around the world.
Welcome back. Before we resume the France 24 debate, some of the stories we're watching for you in the newsroom. Iraq's prime minister in Basra after last week's deadly protests. Haider al-Abadi trying to win over those denouncing corruption and gridlock there and to save his attempts at forming another coalition government. The United States shuts the PLO mission in Washington. The Trump administration says it's over Palestinian refusal to restart peace talks with Israel. Gridlock ahead in Sweden, where the far right has fallen short, but surges enough to leave the left clinging to a razor-thin lead as officials count absentee ballots. The head of tennis's governing body stands by Serena Williams, accusing the umpire in the final of the US Open of sanctioning the American much harder than if she'd been a man. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. France 24, which spoke exclusively with Nicaragua's President Daniel Ortega. Ortega facing the biggest challenge to his presidency since he returned to power in 2007. What started as peaceful protests against pension reform back in April has resulted in a full-scale crackdown by the government that's left more than 200 dead. We're talking about it with Bianca Jagger, founder of the Bianca Jagger Foundation for Human Rights, who joins us from London, from Washington, D.C. Michael McCarthy, research fellow at the American University. Correspondent Sinji Regidor is in San Jose, Costa Rica. She was there with Mark Perlman when Ortega sat down with him. And by the way, that interview, you can watch it in full on our website, france24.com. Just before the break, we were wondering, is there a Trump doctrine when it comes to Latin America? The Trump administration, which likened the situation in both Nicaragua and Venezuela as a security risk for the whole, as a whole, for the region.
Daniel Ortega has adopted the tactics of the dictators he once claimed to oppose. We shouldn't be surprised. Daniel Ortega and Nicolas Maduro are cut from the same corrupt cloth. They are both students of the same failed ideology, and they are both dictators who live in fear of their own people.
Bianca Jagger, before the break, you were saying that the United States doesn't effectively care much about Nicaragua. When you listen to the U.S.'s UN ambassador, Nikki Haley, it sounds like, well, she does care.
I was very happy to hear what Nikki Haley said. In fact, I agree totally with what she's saying. And this is the great dilemma. We may have some questions about what the Donald Trump administration or what he thinks. But I think that what she did and the way she brought forward to the Security Council Nicaragua to be debated was a great thing for human rights, to bring an issue of a conflict that as a preventive measure. And I'm very grateful for what she did. And it doesn't mean that I agree with everything she said. I don't agree with many of the members of Congress who have been putting forward the NICA Act. But I will tell you, as a Nicaraguan, for many years I would have opposed the NICA Act. But I today believe that it will be very important in order for Daniel Ortega to stop him from killing, from persecuting, from torturing, from putting in jail, from kidnapping people, that we stop economic aid, that the donor countries stop economic and military aid to Daniel Ortega. And I will be in New York to give a speech at the Council for the Americas, and I will be going to lobby members of Congress that probably will think that I would have opposed the NICA Act. But I feel that today, because the Nicaraguan people are unarmed and because we don't have a foreign intervention in Nicaragua, the only thing we can hope for to be able to get Daniel Ortega to leave power and allow a free election again in Nicaragua is for the international community to impose sanctions on his members of his government, and for the donor country to stop funding the government of Daniel Ortega that is using to kill his own people.
Cindy Regidor, it's a long and conflicted history between Washington and Managua. Nicaragua occupied by U.S. forces early in the 20th century. Of course, there was that counterinsurgency, the Contras, which tried to topple the Sandinistas in the 1980s. Do Nicaraguans really look to Washington for salvation today?
Well, yes, but not only Washington, not only the United States. I've seen how organizations, human rights organizations, students, and many people who have been involved in protests are trying to reach out to as many people as they can, as many countries as they can. There has been a group of people who have been going to Europe, to South America, to the United States, and they're trying to get as many meetings as possible so that they can spread the word about what's happening in Nicaragua. So I think that what we saw, what Nikki Haley said, was part of that effort that people are doing in order to speak about like human rights violations that are happening in Nicaragua. And like you said, we have a history, but it is only fair to say that this is no longer what is happening in Nicaragua. Right now, like geopolitically, Nicaragua is not important for the United States as it used to be back in the 80s when it was when we were in the middle of a Cold War. So I think people are just trying to use the tools that they have. We have the internet, so it's easy to put out as many evidence, videos, pictures where you can clearly see human rights violations. And we've seen many articles in the United States and European media. And I think this is what we see right now at the UN and all these other forums is just the result of this campaign that people are putting together in order to demonstrate how the government, Ortega's government, is violating human rights.
Yeah, let's remind our viewers of this. What started as peaceful protests against pension reform back in April, now resulting in more than 300 killed. Maud Julien has more.
Thousands again on the streets in Nicaragua's capital on Sunday. Some chanted, "The people united will never be defeated," a socialist slogan directed against a man who was once a champion of the Latin American left wing. President Daniel Ortega is accused of abandoning the ideals of his youth, both economic and political. Critics call him a power-hungry capitalist. Protests demanding his resignation started in April after a controversial social security reform was passed. It has since been withdrawn, but unrest has only intensified. The police is accused of using a shoot-to-kill policy in dealing with demonstrations. At least 320 people have died since April, and a UN report also documented cases of disappearances, torture, and sexual violence. The government, meanwhile, accuses the protesters of terrorism. Hundreds of them are being tried.
My son is not a terrorist, nor are the others. They're in prison just for raising their voice and for loving their country, for loving their blue and white flag. That's why they are there. Protesting is his only weapon.
Earlier this week, the president's supporters also took to the streets, claiming the opposition was responsible for the recent violence. Many still call the president Comandante Daniel and consider him a true patriot.
Michael McCarthy, I want to go back to something you said in part one of our discussion, which is you felt caught off guard like everyone when these protests erupted back in April. How do you explain this groundswell?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a good question, and I don't think we have a complete answer to it. But my sense is that there was an overestimation of how stable the situation in Nicaragua was, and that there was latent discontent, and that it turns out that the situation, therefore, was a lot more fragile than Mr. Ortega thought. And so he thought that he had have the situation sort of on lockdown enough to be able to implement a controversial reform in terms of it having a cost for a significant part of the population, and that ended up having a significant blowback effect on them. And so what I think is that what we need to sort of understand more broadly here is that dictators don't necessarily have their countries under control, even though sometimes it can seem as though you don't really have a mobilized opposition or there's no hope for any type of change to the situation. If I may, I'd like to make two other comments related to what Bianca and Cindy said. And first, I want to say that I think it's quite interesting that Bianca is in this current position of now supporting sort of a sanctions package for Nicaragua. What I would add to that is that there's going to be political pressure for those sanctions, but inside the U.S. foreign policy establishment, the strategic thinking is whether or not sanctions can in fact result in divisions inside the regime. That's usually the calculus about why you do it. And so that's what people are going to be thinking about, whether or not the sanctions are going to result in a kind of become a rallying flag to unify Sandinismo in power, or whether or not they're going to divide the ruling coalition in some sort of fashion. And then I think with regards to Cindy's comments about the human rights issues and the way in which Daniel Ortega has been framing this issue recently in the press, I think that his audience really for these interviews is the international community. And I think that he's really trying to bring, let's say, other countries, small countries around the world who have been, who have other troubled histories with the United States to sort of form a league with them. So you're thinking about the sort of non-aligned movement type of countries. So I don't think his audience about a sort of left-right conflict is really in the country. I think it's, as much as anything, directed towards looking for alliances in Latin America with the left and with other countries that have troubled histories with the United States and other powers.
All about biding for time, Bianca Jagger?
Yes. What I wanted to say, two very important things, that I am not only reaching out to the US, but to the European Union, and that one of the most important things that happened to Nicaragua was the report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that condemned and was very specific and very clear in condemning the crimes that have been committed by Daniel Ortega. The other thing that I think is really important is that, no, we do not think that sanctions will solve the problem, but we find and we think that it will be important for Daniel Ortega not to use those funding to continue to buy weapons and to continue to kill the Nicaraguan people. We need to find ways. We are at a catch-22 situation where you have a population that is fighting for its life, that you have a population that is either being put in jail or is being assassinated, and 25,000 Nicaraguans have already left to go to Costa Rica, and therefore we don't have. This is not a foreign intervention. Let's not fall into that trap in beginning to have a discussion about the U.S. intervening in Nicaragua. We have a dictator. We need to get rid of him. We need to get rid of him without having a war.
Bianca Jagger, he wasn't always a dictator. He, after all, did leave power once after losing at the ballot box. What's happened with Daniel Ortega?
Well, let me tell you something that perhaps many people don't understand. After he lost the elections in 1990, when he came back to power, there were three important things that Daniel Ortega did that he thought had made him lose power during the 1990s election. And one was that he attacked the church. So when he came back to Nicaragua, he made a pact with a different cardinal, Cardinal Obando y Bravo, who suddenly was seen to be campaigning with Daniel Ortega. And in exchange for that, Daniel Ortega introduced a legislation where he brought to the country abortion, which we never had in Nicaragua. Two is that he gave advantages to the richest families in Nicaragua and to the private sector, and many of them did not pay taxes. That was some of what he offered to them. And the third one was to make deals with the most corrupt right-wing political parties and with the former president Alemán, who was in jail, who allowed him to change the constitution so that he could be elected president for life. He changed the constitution 3 times, and he was allowed to dismantle the legal institution. It is not by chance that the people have revolted. It is not, this didn't suddenly happen. It has been building up. Just simply the people finally decided that it was time for Daniel Ortega to go.
Cindy Regidor, in the interview with France 24, Ortega denounces those who criticize the fact that his number 2 is also his partner, Rosario Murillo. He talked of her being a victim of contempt and sexism. I'm thinking back to what Michael McCarthy said a moment ago about the effect of sanctions. How tight is the clan around Ortega?
I would say that it is. I think that right now there aren't many ways out, although they want to give the impression that they have overcome the worst part of the soft coup, is what they call it. But I think that right now there are very little ways out, especially with the country being in a serious economic crisis. Is this what you're asking? I'm not sure if I heard correct. I'm sorry.
No, I'm just wondering about that, about what the siege mentality is, and especially vis-a-vis this question of whether or not sanctions could be effective.
Yeah, well, right now there are news saying that it's only a matter of time when it comes to a serious financial crisis. It is already very serious, and I think that it would definitely have an impact if you mix these kind of like economic sanctions with other kinds of sanctions. And people are also in the streets. There are still protests in the streets, and I think that the combination of all this together, it's making a pressure. It's pressuring, putting pressure in the government, despite of what they say, because they do want to. They want to pretend that everything is back to normal, like I said before.
Michael McCarthy, when you think back a few years, the left had the wind in its sails, not just in Nicaragua, but throughout Latin America. Lula was in Brazil. You had the left in power in Argentina, in a lot of other places. You didn't have the crisis that you're witnessing right now in Venezuela. Is it all just coincidental? Are we doing too much trying to connect the dots, or is there a problem with the left in Latin America?
Well, there's definitely a problem with the left. I think there's a sort of existential crisis on the left about what model the left really supports. I wouldn't really describe the Ortega government or the Maduro government as a left-wing government. I think they're more distinguished by their corruption and dysfunction than anything else, quite frankly. Now, I think you are correct that, a decade ago, the left was riding high and was, in fact, taking some pleasure from the U.S. Going through a financial crisis here with Lehman Brothers and so on and so forth. So a lot has changed in one decade, and it tells you a little bit about the volatility of geopolitics in that regard. Now, I think that the connection between the Nicaraguan crisis and the Venezuelan crisis right now is simply coincidental. What I find interesting is whether or not the crisis roiling Nicaragua will have any sort of ripple effect in Venezuela to sort of rejuvenate, if you will, street protests in opposition to Maduro. So far, we haven't seen anything. Now, I think that if Ortega begins to really teeter in power and there's a chance that he has to leave, that may sort of provide a shot in the arm to the Venezuelan opposition. But so far, we haven't seen any sort of ripple effect or sort of broader regional trend along those lines.
Bianca Jagger, How isolated is Nicaragua these days? What with Venezuela in crisis, the change in leadership in Cuba, how isolated is Nicaragua?
There is something very important that we mustn't forget, because you talked about the rest of Latin America. In the debate at the OAS, the Organization of American States, 22 Latin American countries condemn Nicaragua. So that makes Nicaragua even more isolated. The problem that Daniel Ortega has today is that the countries that are defending are Venezuela and Bolivia, which is very surprising to see that Evo Morales finds and the need to be speaking out in defense of what Daniel Ortega is doing in our country. So they are very isolated. The Latin American countries are beginning to speak out and are beginning to support the people in Nicaragua. The Costa Rican have gone out of the way. Even though they are a very small country, they have been extremely generous, and they have opened their arms to 25,000 people from Nicaragua that have had to escape. But you see Nicaraguans that are beginning to go to other countries, and I imagine that the United States is probably thinking about immigration from Nicaragua. Let's not forget that during the Contra War, there were hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans who left Nicaragua to go to Miami and to many other cities in the United States who are still there. So I hope that we're not going to lose the Nicaraguan people. I hope that we're not going to lose our students who are leaving because they are being persecuted every single day. I have friends who are in jail. I have friends who have been tortured. I'm calling for the release of the political prisoners, and I call on the international community to help us to be able to force Daniel Ortega to stop the persecution of innocent people in Nicaragua.
You heard Michael McCarthy, Bianca, talking about how an interview like the one he granted to us is a way to reach out to the international community. He mentioned in it Germany and Spain. How much traction is he getting?
Well, you know, I think that Daniel Ortega will use any excuse. Yes, I would love Germany and Spain and the European Union to participate in the negotiations with Nicaragua. The truth is that I wish I could believe in this dialogue. I wish that I could believe that he could negotiate with them. I don't believe that Daniel Ortega will negotiate with anyone. I think that Daniel Ortega will fight to death to stay in power, and will kill and will put in prison whatever is necessary, and will force us to leave the country. This is a dictator who has been in power for so long in Nicaragua that has forgotten that he was once the Sandinista leader of a revolution that aspired to have democracy and to have justice in Nicaragua. That is not what Daniel Ortega is, and this is certainly not a left-wing government. Let's be clear about that. His policies have been of the policies of a dictator, not of a leftist leader.
Cindy Regidor, you heard Bianca Jagger there describe all the Nicaraguans who left during the 1980s. Are you witnessing among your friends a brain drain, a similar brain drain now?
Oh, yes. People are migrating to Costa Rica, many of my friends as well. This is something that's happening right now. We have at least 3,000 Nicaraguans coming in to Costa Rica every month. And you have lots of cases where they have been persecuted, that have been tortured, they have been put to jail for a while. And so they're fleeing the country because you have also no jobs. Things are very serious, and like Bianca said, Costa Rica has been very generous. Like the migration policies are very open to Nicaraguans who are fleeing the situation in Nicaragua. I would also like to add on your previous question about how Ortega is kind of alone. I do agree. I think that he's more and more alone, and you see how, for example, the Secretary General for the OAS, Luis Almagro, right at the beginning, he was saying that this was not a dictatorship. He was kind of defending Ortega because Ortega was still talking to them about electoral reforms. And now, a few days ago, 2 days ago, Almagro said very clearly that this is a dictatorship. And I think that this is something very important because even though Daniel Ortega is doing all these interviews and trying to make people believe that this is a coup and this is like a left-wing thing or left and right thing, I don't think that people are actually buying it, especially with a lot of evidence that you can find online, all these videos, all these pictures. It's really hard, especially when you have a situation when you have students and protesters that are not armed, that don't have guns.
But Cindy Regidor, we on 2 occasions saw big protest movements in Venezuela. Everybody thought there's going to be a change. Of course, it didn't happen. For Nicaragua, is it going to be long and hard?
I fear.
I think it's very hard to tell. I think you have this situation, the economic crisis that could explode at any moment now. Although the government, it's not speaking about it and is trying to deny it. It is there. It's real. You have people fleeing. You have people with no jobs. You have 1 million people who are now in poverty because of the situation. And I think this issue can make things go faster. Venezuela has more money than Nicaragua, and so I think that has made a difference in when it comes to the timing. I think that in Nicaragua this could go faster just because the country can't stand it financially speaking. On the other side, you have Daniel Ortega, and you have a person who believes that he has all the right to be there for as long as he wants. So this makes things difficult because I don't see any national dialogue or any other peaceful way for this situation to be over.
A situation that will continue to follow. Cindy Regidor, I want to thank you for joining us from San Jose, Costa Rica. Bianca Jagger in London. Michael McCarthy in Washington, D.C. And thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. A reminder, you can watch that interview with Nicaragua's president in full on our website, France24.com.